tonight we're going to do a couple different things. We're going to talk a little bit about noise, and we're also going to talk a little bit about shapes. The two, I believe, can work together very well. Um, Slide it down did not work either. I apologize for that. I don't know. I'm going to have to look into that, or I'll get Jesse to look into that and see if we can find you a fix, but we don't know of any off the top of our heads. I apologize for that. So, today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about how shaping can really kind of add some finesse to your to your wire patches. So, in this particular case, we're using a grid system with a Perlin noise. Um, Perlin noise is here. We're going to scroll in just a little bit. And what that Perlin noise is doing is it's randomly generating the size of the shape of the squares, right? So they're expanding and contracting at random intervals. So it'll start at 0 and then go to 5 and then it'll go to 8 and then it'll go back to 3 and then 4, then 5, then 0, so on and so forth. And it just it continually randomly generates. In this particular case, I actually have two sets going on. So you'll notice that there's this big set here, and then there's a very similar repeated set here, and then they're connected together. Excuse me. And then what happens is then we have this, excuse me, man, apologize. This video mixer that's mixing all this together, and I'm gonna explain some of this. A lot of this part here is more just kind of to basically give the customer, the person who's using this, the ability to make modifications and all kinds of different things. So that is something that the hard way back over. Sorry, I'm awesome. So we're going to go through this. Let's do this. Okay. So down over here, let's start with we're going to talk first about shapes. We're going to basically give kind of a brief description of how those work. I'm sure that most of you probably have an understanding of how this works, but we're just going to do a quick thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start on a blank part of the canvas and we're just going to go through a few shapes. So if you double left click, when you double left click in Wire, you get your options and they're subcategorized by subject, I guess you could say, right? And in this particular case, we're going to do shape. And when you go to shape, you have all these different options that you can play with. Some of these options are things that I apologize. Some of these things are not specifically shapes themselves, but they're things that you can do to shapes. For example, union, intersection, and then there's a couple others. The subtract, uh, the union, the subtract, the mirror. There's all these different ones. Repeat. A lot of those different options are available to be applied to a shape. They're not basically used in any other kinds of processes. So we're going to start with something basic. I'm going to do rectangle. There are no squares because obviously you could use a rectangle to make a square, which is just it's on both sides it's the same size, right? So 1 by 1. So you could do a 1 by 2, right? And you get a 1 by 2 space. Now this is incrementally happening. So I'm going to scroll in here a little bit. You'll notice that the 2 high seems very long, and the reason being is because everything in Wire is decimals, right? So you basically probably want to do like 0.5 on the height, and then you have 1 on the width. So you have this 2-to-1 ratio, if you will. But we can do any kind of size here. We could do like 0.3 to 0.4, which is your excuse me, they were other way around, 0.4 by 0.3, which is the width and height. 4.3 is a typical monitor size back in the day. Right now it's 16 by 9, so we would do 1.6 by 9, and the other way around, yet again, 9 by 1.6. And so now we have a 16 by 9 square. So that's basically the gist of this is that uh, there's not really too much crazy about this. You just basically enter in how big you want it to be, and then you can make it any size, right? So we can do 1.2, 1.2. And so then we have this shape. You also can round the corners, and if you round the corners, it's all done again by increments and decimal places, so 0.15, and it will round the corners starting with this right bottom side, and then the next one should be the bottom left side, I believe, so 0.15. Nope, I was wrong. It goes counterclockwise. So we have 0.15 yet again. Oh, I'm sorry, I learned something new. It is not counterclockwise. It's the when you're tightening a lug nuts on your car on your wheel. It's doing bottom right, top right, bottom left, top left. 1.5. So now we have rounded corners, and those can be rounded up to one, which is literally a circle. It'll be an oval because it's not round on all sides, of course. So if I wanted to do that, I would make this one, and so now we have a circle, right? This can be kind of really kind of interesting because this allows for all kinds of interesting effects, right? So you could, in theory, do a float. Float is a not an integer. It is a like a decimal number, right? But what we could do is we could do like, for instance, I'm going to change this out. Actually, I'm going to use a float in. I usually use float ins because I want to be able to modify that myself at any time, right? So now I have a slider, and so then I can plug this into corners, and it will round out all the corners all at the same time. And that is because of the fact that it is saying float in. It assumes that this is a float 4, even though this is float in because it's connecting to the corners, and the corners is being used. So I'm going to take this off for just 1 second. You'll notice that there are 4 places here that is for a float 4, right? So technically I could do a float 4, and what I could do is then plug that in here, and now you'll notice that W is the far end, right? So if I do 0, what I could do is I could actually round out like these corners, the top corners, or I could round out like the opposing corners, right? So now when I move this slider, it just affects just those spaces. So that's one of the things that's really nice about float 4. But in this particular case, I'm just going to stick with this. I think this is a very unique kind of look. This is just basically about shapes anyways. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we can modify this, right? So for instance, any of you guys use vector format? Do you guys know the typical ins and outs of how vector works? Vector is a mathematical equation behind the scenes. Stop me if you've heard this. But basically, what we can do is we could, for instance, make, I don't know, let's do a cross, right? And so now we have a cross and a rectangle, or, well, not a rectangle. It's more of this kind of like, looks like almost like a leaf, right? Um, what we could do with these two shapes is we could move one. So I'm going to double left click again, move. And there's two ways you could do a move, by the way. This is the cheap version, I guess you could say, right? And then there's transform. Okay. Transform, whoops, not transform 2D. Transform is like the big brother of just move. And the reason being is you can see there are multiple options within a transform. It doesn't just do left and right translation, and I'm going to show you what that means in just 1 sec. But it also does the rotation, the scale, and the anchor. The anchor is for the translation and rotation, right? So you can change where it's the anchor is the middle point where it rotates or where it translates. So basically this transform gives you all kinds of different options, but in this particular case I'm going to use a move because I just want to move it. I don't want to rotate it. I don't want to do anything else. I just want to make it move just a little bit, right? So I'm going to offset it, and so now I have these two shapes. In theory I could join them, but in this particular case let's use a subtract, and I'm going to do subtract shape, not subtract math. And when you do a subtract, it's going to subtract from the left from the right. And as you can see, you get this kind of shape as you move this away. So what's happening right at this moment is that the plus sign at the very top is being eaten by the um, leaf-like rectangle on the bottom, and you get this bizarre shape. So far, you guys with me? Nothing really crazy here. You can smooth out the edges if you so choose to. This is nice for other kinds of like effects, but you can also do it the opposite way around. We could take the leaf shape and then subtract the plus, right? And then we could also change the size, right? Bring it down, the thickness, and we could round the edges. This round is kind of interesting because it rounds out the middle. It like the plus, instead of rounding out the corners of the plus, it rounds out the edges of the plus. So in that particular case, if you did want to round out the corners, let's say, just for grins and giggles, let's say you wanted to round out the corners, what would we do? We would just take a rectangle, make one lengthwise, make one widthwise, and then change the corners and add a union. And union will basically merge two pieces together. And so if we had, we'll just make another rectangle. All I did was hit Alt on my keyboard and drag that rectangle, and that's how you're able to make a second option here. Okay, so then what I can do is I could, in theory, just plug this in, right? And we'll change these values to 0 to 0 to 0 to 0. And so now we have this, and we're going to do 0.5, and actually let's do 0.25. Yeah, that looks okay. And then we'll do 1.25. And so that looks not bad. I think that works. I'm gonna make another one. We're just gonna reverse the order of these, right? So now I'm gonna do 1.25 and oops, 0.25. Right. So now I have one that goes vertical, one that goes horizontal, and now when I plug them both together, I get a plus. Right. That's pretty much what a cross is, right? Nothing crazy there. If I did a union, you'll notice that it unions in the middle again. But we have the option to change the corners, the edges. So we could go 0.25, right? And now we have around corners on the edge and rounded corners on the horizontal, vertical, and on the horizontal square edges, right? Or if we wanted to go crazy, we could just plug this into here and plug this into here, and right, and so now we have rounded corners there. And we can basically change those by basically changing our rounded values, our float in value. So far, that's a fairly easy kind of quick tutorial, quick thing about how shapes are made. Please, I have to say this again. Raise your hand if you have any questions, or write it in the chat. We're always watching. Jesse can monitor and allow me to know if somebody raises a question. I don't see it. I am watching the chat, but just in case if I get stuck or caught into something, and he can flag me down. So please ask the questions. I really want to know what you guys think. Okay. So we have this union and we have this subtract, right? These are just two different options. We could round the corners, for instance, right? But they're all universal. So anything that you do to all I have a cross here and I have a rectangle here, right? In theory, I could put another float in, right? And I could put a float in on the round, right, and make that rounded middle. And then what I could do is I could also make another float in, and I could make the size, right? Change the size from 0 to 1. I could change the thickness, right? I could just plug this in like this. Now, there is a different kind of thing that you can do here. You notice that what I did was I just basically hit Alt and dragged it, right? And I could do it that way. That there's nothing wrong with that. That's very valid, right? It's an easy way to do it. But in some cases, or in all cases rather, you can just right click on one of your nodes and say expose as input, and it basically already titles it for you, and it basically gives you the value. Now, the thing is, you'll notice that it's just a plus or minus value. There's no slider bar. And the reason being is because it needs a max and a minimum in order to get a slider bar. For whatever reason, that's how it's set. Okay. However, it also makes it easy because then I can just say expose as input. This is just a float, and this is just a float in. So we have two float ins. This one doesn't have a maximum, so I add in a maximum, and so now I have a slider bar, right? The thing with the float ins is that I can set the minimum and the maximum. Can be a negative number. There's something else that's very interesting about floats, right? In this particular case, we wouldn't use a negative number. However, the option is there. If you put a negative number on something like a cross, for instance, it's not going to do anything. 0 times 0 is 0, so there's not really anything you could really do there. But you'll notice, like for instance, in the translation, there is a negative number here, but it doesn't show because it's just -0, so it's not going to go anywhere. But if I did a float 2, for instance, float 2, right, for X and Y, I plug that into here and I right click and say expose input, and we'll right click again, expose input. And so now we have the two options, right? I'm going to move my cross up. I'm going to move these, kind of arrange them in a certain way. Now, you'll notice that I'm spending an awful lot of time on arranging. Is there a way that I can make it so I can auto arrange? Yes, there is. You can select all your nodes that you want to arrange. It doesn't have to be these ones. We could just do just this set, right? I could just go up to auto layout and it automatically lays them out for me if I so choose to. It's a good feature. It's nice. It's handy dandy. Also, another thing that's nice is like, let's for instance say I want to color these differently so that I can identify them quickly. So here are all my shapes, for instance, and all of them have been set to a color. This is very useful, especially when you have lots of spaghetti monster kind of stuff going on where you have tons of nodes and you're trying to figure out where everything goes. There's also an option for comments. If you go down to UI or you just type in comments, COMM, you'll get the comment option, which basically allows you to write a dissertation if you so chose to, or you could say fill and just have the title at the very top. It gives you these random titles, which is kind of funny. But you can name this anything you want. You can change the size of it. You can change where the title is, the center, the left, the right, the font size. And then what you can do is you can actually move it around your specific area that you want to basically name. It keeps it easy to understand where you are at, right? So that's a nice little feature. And you can change the color to those as well, just like you can change the color to any of the other stuff. So that's a nice feature. So let's see. So far we've talked about subtract. We talked about the union. Some other ones. Let's talk about some of the other shape kinds of ways of um, merging two shapes together, right? Because you can make a whole bunch of shapes. There's tons of shapes in here. There's the chevron, there's the cross, there's the circle. We'll come to edge in just one second. The equilateral triangle, which is this way, and then there's also another triangle. I always forget the differences of the names, but basically one is different from the other. I'm pretty sure there's a second triangle in here somewhere. Maybe it's just the equilateral. And I'm thinking, nope, there is. There's the other triangle. So the equilateral triangle is a little bit different because it only gives you like one, like it's equilateral, which basically means that all the points are like the same size, right? So the triangle on all three sides is the same. It's equilateral. And they're all the same edge distance, right? This particular triangle allows you to change the direction of where, basically where your triangle starts and begins. So this one gives you the option to change the points in X and Y Z, or excuse me, X and Y direction. So you can get some really crazy triangles. Um, the reason why you would want to do something like that is like, for instance, you may want to make like a triangle kind of polygon kind of thing, but there's also polygons. You could actually create a polygon if you so chose to. So if you knew where your points were, you could technically make a polygon. Um, for those of you out there who may not know what a polygon is, you could do like a float 4, we'll say, and then you plug that in. No, wait, let me think about this. It's been a while since I've done this. Points. Let me think about this. Generates a procedural polygon. Let me think. Oh yeah, I think it's a float. So if you do a float, let's do a float in, and what you do is you change your instance count. Um, or maybe it's not a float in. I think maybe you have to do a float. Give me 1 second here. I think it is just a float. Yeah, instances. So now if I do like 4 instances and I plug that in, it should tell me that I have multiple values, but it's telling me only the left and right direction, right? So what I would actually need to do is actually create 2 floats, and what I would need to do is do a float 2, and the reason why is because you need X and Y values. So we're going to do a float 2, and you plug this into the polygon, and this into this, and this into this. And so now you should have 4 instances of your X and Y values. And when you make those changes to those values, once I remember how to do that, I go here. So once you make those changes to those values, we'll go negative and do one like that. And then I'm going to do one here. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go to the little, looks like 3 lines. Some people say burger, doesn't really matter. It's that little shape, right? And so then when you move it, you have now 4 points. Right, this is on a grid system. If you want to know more about polygons, let me know. I can give you a whole bunch of information and fill your head full of all kinds of crazy stuff. But basically, the short of it is that these X and Y values translate to this edge, this edge, this edge, and this edge. And so you're able to make any kind of shape your heart's desire with a polygon. Now, that being said, the more the more values you have, the more float values you have in that. Like you could have one with 25 if you so chose to, 25 nodes, I guess you could say, because technically these are kind of a node system. Like in a vector graphic, it's the same kind of process. Um, However, the biggest issue with that is the more nodes you have, like if you had like 20 sets of polygons and all 20 sets had 15 nodes or floats, it would your system was going to choke on it. And then the reason why is because it's just so many different fragments. And you can like you can make it so that these are all, like for instance, I could do a scene, SINE, right? And this is an oscillator. We haven't really talked about these just yet, right? And so this is a pattern oscillator, and it basically just goes from 0 to 1, and then back from 1 to 0, 0 to 1, 1 to 0. And you can change this. Like it's right at this moment, it's actually going. I think it's going -1 to 1, not 0 to 1, because unipolar is 0 to 1 and it'll stop at 1 and then go back to 0. So if I plug this into here, you're not going to see anything. What I need to do is change my values. And so the reason being is because it's telling each one that they're all the same. So what I would need to do is I would need to change this value, the instances, to 4. And what I would need to do is give them all a random value like this. And so now you get at least something. So it's only oscillating on the vertical. It's not oscillating on the horizontal, of course, because and they're all the same. They're all oscillating the same. But basically, this is just to give you an idea of how you can oscillate or make your shapes move. Really, the basics to this is that you want to create your shape first. In my particular case, in my opinion, I would do the shapes first, get them where you want them, and then make your modifications how you want them to move. And most of the time, it's a little bit easier to do it that way because then sometimes you're not talking about actually physically moving the nodes. You're talking about physically moving the entire shape because you don't want this kind of thing where you're modifying each one individually. You just want to modify the entire shape as is. So hopefully I haven't lost you guys on that. That's the basics of polygons. Polygons are a unique breed, but they are very, very interesting. There's all kinds of crazy stuff you can do with them. It's really up to you. Okay, so we talked about equilateral triangles. We were going to talk about intersection. Intersection's a little bit interesting because, like for instance, we have this cross. For instance, I'm gonna make it thicker and make it a little bit bigger. Is that as big as float? Let me see if I can increase that thickness. I think the reason why is yeah, okay. So my thickness, here's a good example. Okay. My thickness is not thick enough. I want my plus to be a big, thick boy. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to my thickness, my float two, that's called thickness at the top. I'm going to change my value right at this moment. It says my max value is 0.5. I'm gonna change that to like 5, right? And so now I can actually increase that all the way up to 5. That's probably a little too much, right? Because 1 to 0 is about as far as I can go. So actually, I'm going to break this back down to 1. And the reason why is because then it's going to be easier to control on the slider because it's only going from 0 to 1 instead of 0 to um, 0 to 5. So even this is probably too high. It's still kind of going crazy. I'm gonna do like 0.85, and so now it's a little bit easier to control. I can really kind of, I can go up to 0.85, but you'll notice that it kind of stops at like 0.35 is the highest that it can go. So in any case, I'm not gonna worry too much about that. We're gonna make it a little bit thicker, and then like we can make the size bigger here, right? This is also another case where the max count is 0.43. We'll do 1, and so now I should be able to make it pretty long, pretty the uh, the edges, the arms of the plus, I guess you could say, right? I can extend them pretty high. But the reason why I'm doing this is because I want to basically make it so that this cross is at an intersection. So we're going to intersect it with, we have the rectangles. Let's do a different shape. We'll do heart because that is a default shape. And we're going to take the heart and we're going to plug it into the intersect. And so now we just get the intersection of where the cross and the heart meet. And so if I go to the intersection, you'll notice that there's certain edges of that heart that have been cut out. And the reason being is because we have that plus that is intersecting with that heart right where it is, right? So where the two shapes are overlapped on top of each other, those are the only areas that you're going to see. So if I make my plus extra large or I make my heart extra large, you'll notice that there's this cut in the top, and that cut is from the top of the heart. Same thing with the edges here. So what I could do, for instance, we're going to start talking about now about shape rendering. Shape render is a way to make a couple different kinds of controls. So if I plug this into this area, it's going to say, okay, you have a shape area or shape renderer. Renderer does all kinds of cool stuff. It'll allow you to change the resolution. It will allow you to add anti-aliasing. So if you did 30, for instance, you'll notice there's this fuzzy kind of look. Excuse me. It's a cheap way of making blur. We were talking about this in one of the last tutorials where sometimes if you want a cheap blur, you could just do an anti-aliasing and call it done, call it a day. This is cheaper than trying to do a blur. When making a patch, there will be times where you have a big gigantic spaghetti monster. This is an easy way to kind of save some space, and sometimes this works better than trying to use the blur itself. But in this particular case, we're going to take away the anti-aliasing. We're going to talk a little bit about we're going to talk a little bit more about what Shape Renderer does. Right? There's also the option for camera, which will allow you to do camera 2D. If I say if I drag this out, it'll give me the option for camera 2D. Camera 2D is also another one of those cheaper versions of translation, right? We were talking or transformation. We were talking about the options to zoom, scale, or excuse me, scale, rotate, and translate. Translate means move up and down, left to right, right? That's what this kind of does as well. It gives you the option for zoom, and it also gives you the option to plug in a transform, which will allow you to move it left to right, top to bottom. It'll allow you to rotate it and do all kinds of different other stuff, right? But it also has this option for color. Color is very interesting in a shape because it's only for solid colors, right? I don't believe it'll give you the option to do a gradient. However, it will allow you to do just that. Like I could just pick a color and it'll basically allow me to have that. It's just an easy, cheap way of adding a color into a shape. And the reason why I would do that is because then I could go join, right? Or yes, I'm gonna do join in this particular case. Okay, so join, the difference between video mixer and join. Join does the top is the bottom, the output 0 is the bottom, and the next input is on top of that. And you'll notice that now I have this kind of shape, right? So you'll also notice that this camera 2D here is different than the actual intersection because what happened was I said, I want to go to the heart, take the heart and make an intersection out of that. But separately from that, I also want to make a shape renderer and it to have a zoom. So if I were to change this to point 0.8, let's say, and the other intersection and join them together, you'll notice that the heart is still intersection with the cross, but it's not reaching the edges, and the reason being is because I have the shape renderer here. The shape renderer is telling it to be smaller than the actual original heart. And so this is how you can really kind of make some really interesting things because technically you could add an oscillator here. Do we still have that oscillator? We don't. That's all right. I'll just make an oscillator. It's sin or scene, right? However you say that. So now I have this oscillating heart here. But you'll notice it's going from -0 to 0 or -1 to 1. We're going to change it to unipolar. So now it's just going 0 to 1 and we're going to say I think it's the offset if I remember correctly, zero point 0.5 and then we'll change this to zero point 0.5 to 0.25. No, 0.75, I think. There. Or actually we could use zero point 0.5. Because it's telling it where to start, offset at 5, and then increase to zero point 0.5, which would be 1. Now, the thing with the scene oscillator is that we also have the option for frequency. Frequency is just how fast it goes. So if we want it to go really crazy, hmm, sorry, I'm trying to drink my coffee quickly before it goes cold. Okay. Ooh. Phase offset is to offset that. If you had multiple, let's say you had multiples of these going on at the same time, the phase offset would basically just allow you to offset it from another one. So you could have two going at the same time in different intervals, right? And you can change this. So for instance, you could have one contracting while the other one's expanding, and so they're in tandem moving together. Or you can have them offset just slightly so that as one is just getting, as it's just leaving to shrink, the other one's shrinking right behind it. So it's just a little bit behind. So they're kind of more moving like a carburetor engine, right? So it's moving in a more fluid manner. There's all kinds of different things you could do with this. In any case, that's the basics of shapes. There are some other things here to play with. So let's actually kind of go through some of that. Um, did we go through exclude? We went through extract. Let's do extrude or exclude pretty just quickly here real quick. Extrude is the opposite of intersection. Intersection is basically where the two pieces meet is what you're going to see. With extrude is uh, the within the both of the areas, those are the parts that it's going to remove, right? So if we had this and this, it's just excluding just the parts where the two of them meet in the middle. So everything else is there, right? So this was the cross. So if I go to subtract, you'll notice this was the shape, right? Because it made the shape from the subtraction, and then we're saying take this shape and exclude it from the heart. So you'll notice that now those reversed images are the excluded. That's what exclude does. And then let's see what other things. There's some fun stuff here too. I also wanted to go through, like for instance, you have the option for mirror, right? So if you have like this, I can it's already mirrored, of course, right? But as I move them away from each other, you get this the center line is right here and it's mirroring the two objects. So what you could do is in theory, like for instance, I have it on the horizontal, I have the option to also make it vertical as well, right? So then you get this kind of mirrored effect going up. This is really kind of fun when you have like um, well, it's just there's lots of things you can do with it, right? It's a mirrored effect. Uh, the one that I love to play with is distance lines. This one is lots of fun because it does this. Distance lines is a like it's just that. It's like the distance lines that you see in GLSL, and it has the option for thickness, right? So I could do 0.015. And so now I have these really, really thin lines, right? And I could make more lines by adding a distance, changing the distance. So if I did 0.015, it's really, really, really tiny. So now I need to make this even tinier, 0.0000015. That's too small. Let's see if we can increase that a little bit. Oh, it's too much. But you'll notice that, I mean, that's very tight. Let's increase that just a little bit. So that's a little better. But there's all kinds of fun stuff you can do with this. I actually used this in one of my patches for Juicebar. This was a part of contour lines, I believe. And in contour lines, I was able to use this as a way to make um, contour patterns. So short version is you can take this and you can put it in with a video mixer, right? You have a video mixer here, and we'll use something like, let me think. We could do just a fractal. That's probably going to be the easiest fractal noise. And we have this here, and I'm going to plug this into here and plug this into here. And so now we have these two patterns overlapping on top of each other, but if we merge the multiply, and if we take this and Gaussian blur it, so if I do a blur and I plug this into the blur, plug this into the blur, and then increase the blur, they start to merge, and then do a threshold. This will be on the test later, so. Um, if you if you start to merge them, they start to like if I soften this just a little bit, what happens is the lines will start to like blur together and these edges will start to like blend. It's hard to see on this because it's not just vertical, it's also heart, right? But if I blur this even more, I should be able to really give it a good example. But you're starting to see it here at the edges. They're starting to show these thinner lines as it's being blurred. So if I move this and I might need to move this up a little bit, 0.25, 0.25. And so if you took an image, it doesn't have to be noise. I just use noise because that's the easiest, quickest way, right? But it could be any kind of shape, and it'll start to make these kinds of patterns where you have this step down process into your shape, and so it creates these contour lines that are around your shape, and you can do that to anything. So if I did a texture in, actually, would probably be a better example, and I plug that in, and so now as they get closer, they start to create these like merged lines. And I'll give you an example of that later. A better example, because I think I'm going to need a picture in order to do that. But in any case, that's the short version of how that works. Um, so contour lines are lots of fun, or distance lines. Let's see, what other things are in here? You have hexagons, hexagram, which is the star. You can change the amount of points, I believe. Actually, no, I'm sorry. You can only change the size. I thought that you could actually change the star. Maybe that's just star. It probably is. Yep, star. So you can change the amount of sizes on star, right? I was thinking of that, not hexagram. I don't know why you would need a hexagram versus a hexagon versus a star, because star technically would do the same kind of shape. I'm not sure why you would need that, because that's what, 6 sides? Hex, yeah, 6 sides. Hmm. And if you did outer radius, if you change that, you could make relatively the same size. I don't know why you would need one shape over the other, but in any case, it is there. Excuse me. There's edge. Edge is also something that's very interesting to use. So if we go shape and edge, this makes exactly that. It makes an edge. So let's take out distance lines, and we're going with this little shape here. If I plug this into, oh, I can't do that. If I plug this one into here, you'll get this shape, right? Basically, it's creating an edge from that cross with a heart, and its size and thickness is based on a decimal point as well. So 0.025. That's a little too small. We'll probably have to take out an extra zero. And then what I could do is then take this and put this into the join. And so now I have this, right? So there's some really interesting things you can do with shapes. All of this is to talk about the ability to do all of the stuff at the bottom. So quickly, we're going to try to explain this a little better. Um, Basically, what I have here is I have a grid pattern. Actually, let's move that down just a little bit. I also have a random speed generator. I have it's being divided by 2000, and the reason being is because we're creating. Let's see if I can show you the shape. This. This is just a circle. But you'll notice that on the circle, it actually says that there are 25. There are 25 instances of this circle. If I scroll back a little bit or go back a little bit, you'll see a place where here, transform. Okay, my pattern here has 25 instances. And the reason being is because this grid pattern is a 5 by 5. Grid pattern is something that allows you to take your transform and add to. Let me give you an example. I think this would be easier to understand if I give an example. If I have a circle, not that circle, let's use a different one, circle, the shape, not the 2D. Here is a circle. I'm going to use a transform, TRAN transform, and I'm going to plug that into here. Nothing crazy here. I'm just going to change this to 0.25. Let's do a little bit smaller. 0.2. Yeah, I don't think that's too crazy. Okay, and then I have this grid pattern. I'm going to plug the grid pattern into the transform. And so now we have all of these squares, or all these circles. There should be 25 because it's a 5 by 5. Uh, let me take this out because I actually want to use another grid pattern to explain this a little bit. Because then I can modify that, and it's not going to change the node that it's on right now. So here's a grid pattern. It's a 5 by 5 yet again. You'll notice that the size is actually a 5 by 5 space, right? So if I increase this, you'll notice that there's now spacing in between those, right? And so because this is a 4-3 grid, I'm probably going to want to change the rows to 6. Is it that way? No, it's the other way around. I'm sorry. I'm going to want to change the columns to 6 or 7. And the reason being is because it'll take up some of that space. So we could actually do probably like 4 at the top and 3, 4. So now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 4 up. So now there's less space in between. There's still a bigger gap here. And so a lot of this is just kind of finessing it, right? This size is saying the entire thing is 1.5 by zero point 0.8. If I shrink these numbers, they'll get closer to each other, but it's a grid system. So it basically just allows you to kind of modify how that grid system is set out. There's also the circle pattern. Circle patterns are a little bit different. And I keep trying to type in the wrong thing. Sorry about that, guys. Here's circle pattern. And circle pattern does exactly that. It goes in a circle instead of the grid, right? So now I have 10 circles, the radius of 0.5. I can increase the size of the radius and I can change the angle. If by changing the angle, it just basically makes it so that you can basically have them like a semicircle kind of thing, right? And then I could change the radius yet again. So there's all kinds of cool stuff you can do with this, right? It makes all kinds of cool patterns. If you want to know more about this, there's plenty of wonderful tutorials within Wire. If you go to your open tutorial, there's tons of stuff in here about how to make shapes and transform. The transform one is amazing. There's all kinds of crazy stuff there. Also on Resolume's website under wire patches for tutorials, there's lots of great information there as well. Their tutorials are amazing. They go through a lot of different things in depth. I would strongly suggest looking over their tutorials as well. But that's in a nutshell how grid patterns and circle patterns work. What I'm doing here is I'm actually using a grid pattern here. I'm asking it how big is it, and it says, hey, it's 25. Okay, no problem. So we're going to make a circle pattern. And the reason why is we're using the circle pattern to make the oscillation, right? And so it's taking that grid system and it's accumulating. It's making a Perlin uh, expand and contract, right? And it's just randomly. Perlin is basically a random generator, but it's different from a typical random noise generator because yet again, this is where we get into noise. Noise is a very uh, wonderful, simple, and complex idea that I think is amazing. So Perlin came up with this idea. I'm trying to remember the guy's first name, but his last name is Perlin. He came up with this idea that he noticed that when he was doing his his graphs, his randomizations, it would go from 1 to 15 to 100, back down to 0, back to 20, back to 45, back to 100, and so it was all over the place. It was making this real static, spiky kind of graph. And what he wanted to do was create more of a smooth motion. And that's where Perlin came in. He actually kind of created a Gaussian blur or a smooth curve, right? And so that's where we get our fractal curve, FRAC, fractal noise. And the fractal noise is exactly that same kind of process. As a matter of fact, if you go in here, there's an option for Perlin noise. And you can you can increase the amplitude or the gain so that you get white, white, whites and dark, dark, darks. This is a cloud um, map that you usually typically saw in Photoshop, right? And there's all kinds of crazy things you can create with this. But what this does is it allows you to change the frequency so that it's not so noisy. So you don't get any of the pits and valleys in the bigger pits and valleys. You can change the amplitude, which basically creates like this kind of like the striations, right? But if you do like more less with the amplitude, it creates more of a more smoother pattern where it's you still get the peaks and valleys, but it's not like so stark, right? You also have your option for octaves. And octaves are usually with your amplitude. It's just it's ways to kind of modify this so that it can be moved. The density is how dense those areas are. In some cases, you might want more pits and valleys, right? Or you can have no pits and valleys, right? You can have 0.25, and 0.25 is too big. We can take it to like 0.13, and so now we have these ginormous pits and valleys. Excuse me, pits and valleys. You can change the direction of where those noises are. And I know this is probably like, okay, Jake, how is this? I can hear it in my mind. I should probably explain to you what I mean by the noise being a one and a zero in in gradations. Sorry. In when you have like in Photoshop. In Photoshop, you have 0 and 1. 0 is black and 1 is white or vice versa. Okay? In this random generator, the black is the 1, right? Or the 0, and the white is the 1 or the 0. It's the opposite side, right? And so it's creating this peaks and valleys based on the gradations of value. So like for instance, this gray here is going down from 1 or excuse me, down from 0 at black, let's say, and it goes all the way up to maybe this is probably like 50. You'll notice that this area is white, so this is 100, right? And so they're just basically creating random generations of noise by using a grayscale map. And so height maps are basically built on this. That's how the height maps work. Is it's a value from 1 to 0 or 0 to 1, right? And it allows you to make all kinds of crazy things. If you can understand this, there's plenty of things you can do with it as far as height maps. You can use this to control how things are being used in the displacements. And so that's the reason noise is important is because it allows you to do some really interesting stuff. And I'll give you an example. Let's delete this. I'm using Perlin noise here. Just know this is the same kind of thing as we were just looking at, except for it just gives you a random number. The random number is not, it's random, but it's a smooth random, right? So it doesn't jump everywhere in the grand scheme of things. It still kind of smooths out things and it's being added to a value, and that's so that I can control where the value starts and where the value begins or ends, right? And the reason that I'm doing that is because if you look at my circle only gets so big and so large and so small, right? And there's a purpose behind that. The reason being is because as they can expand and contract, I don't want them to go exactly to 0, right? Or I don't want them to go to 100 as they expand and contract. And the reason being is because I don't want them larger than this size here. Okay. So I have this grid system that is unpacking those X and Y values. So this grid system, it doesn't look like a grid system because they're all kind of randomly shuffled, but there are 25 squares individually that are randomly X and Y, Z coordinates. Okay. Or X and Y, Z coordinates, excuse me, X and Y coordinates. So there is a grid system there, but I've actually told it slightly change them just a little bit. Don't change them completely. Just give them a random value. Okay. And I'm doing that by going in here in the pack or unpack, right? So I have this grid here. Okay. The grid is the number of values. So let me see if I can give you an example. So here's my squares. Okay. And I'm transforming them And down here, you'll notice that this transform has a whole bunch of values attached to it, right? That's this float. This float here is the grid system. All I've done is told it to unpack. Okay. So I told it, take these 25 nodes, these where the basically the grid pattern is a X and Y value. It's telling it where on the X and Y scale each square should be. I've unpacked all 25, and what I've done is I've added a plus or minus to those to randomly set them. If I've lost you, please let me know. This basically allows me to unpack all of those values that are in each and individual 25 of those nodes, okay, or of those spaces on the grid, and add a random value to those right here. So you'll notice right here it says random, okay? I have 25 instances, make them uniform, which means that they're not going statically crazy everywhere. It's just a kind of more of a uniform kind of look. And what I've done is I've just kind of kept these values the default, right? The only two values I've changed really is the minimum and maximum because I only want to add negative 2.5, basically negative 2.5 in the X direction on the left or right. I only want to go just a little bit of a different value. I don't want a whole bunch of value difference, but just a little bit. And we're in this particular case, we're talking about one square, not all of them for right at this moment, just the one. Okay. Even though instances says 25, because there's 25 squares, let's just take one for example. I'm telling it in every case of every 25 of those squares, randomly offset negative or positive 0.25. And then I'm adding that to the value that's already there in that X value. And then I'm also doing the same thing in the Y value. So I'm telling it only to move negative 0.25 uh, up or down from where its current location is. And then I packed them together and I added them to the float too, and then I transformed it again. And so that's the reason why they're slightly off centered. Now, I've set up a trigger. So now what I can do is it's set for transport beat right at this moment. I'm going to go down here. I'm going to set it to just trigger, and I'm going to set this one to just trigger. So now when I trigger, I get a random value automatically on every trigger. And it's also set to transport beat. So if I push the play button, they randomly generate on the transport beat or the metronome, which is a speed, right? A set speed of wherever you want them to be. Now, a couple little things about how this is set up. This is very similar to what we did in the second video. The second tutorial, it's the same process. I just created a gate with different types of values that you can select through. You have the option as a drop down to choose just trigger, transport beat, or metronome. And it's set into a gate and it's set to trigger. And that trigger is set to make a random value change every time. And that random value has an instance of 25. I've set it to a smooth. The smooth is probably the thing that we haven't really talked about yet. Smooth is basically an ability to make it so that it doesn't just skip to a value. It eases into those values. It doesn't just go directly to a specific number, right? For example, I said point negative 25 to 25. Instead of going directly to 0.25, it it makes the values all the way to that number, wherever the ending number is. So you get this kind of slide, right, as it's moving around. It's not doing it completely in one shot. If I took out the smooth, it'd give a good example. You notice that now they skip. They don't really ease into it. So I'm going to change that back. Okay. So now, this last part, basically, I had these squares. I really like how this kind of comes out, but I want to basically make them so that the edges smooth or kind of create this kind of curve every time they touch together. So I actually had to split all 25 squares apart. Now, there's a reason why I chose 25 because your splits only go up to 25 channels. After 25 channels, they no longer allow it. It too much for the system to process, and so it'll crash if you go more than 25. Actually, it won't even allow you to do it, right? So I have 25 values, and what I did was I unioned them together, which basically means that when you take two shapes and put them together as a union, now they're one whole. And the reason for that is not because they don't look like they're union right now, but because of the smoothing option. I wanted them to start to smooth. You'll notice as they get closer to each other, they start to merge and melt together. And I like that look. That's what I want. And I want that with the circles too, so that they start to kind of do this kind of bubbly kind of like they start to curve into each other. Now you can really pump this up and make it do some crazy things. This is actually starting to look very much when you start to do this, right? It's starting to look like a lava lamp, but it's also starting to look more like if you've ever used a meta shapes. Meta shapes do this naturally. Uh, except when they don't show. Why are my meta shapes not showing? Probably because I have too much going on. That's interesting. And I don't have anything turned on. Okay. Rectangle, margins. Oh, not meta shape. Sorry. That's why. I apologize. I'm a dunderhead. Meta balls. Meta balls do the same exact thing as what we were just doing. So if I increase the grid, right, you'll notice that as the distance gets closer, they start to merge together. They create these larger and bigger kind of um, clumps, right? And if I create a threshold, I can even increase that a lot more. So now as a threshold, if I increase my number, and actually I have to change this, I need to make a black background like that. And then I should be able to, there. So you'll notice that now they start to merge together with the threshold. It keeps them sharp. The threshold it basically is a value. It's basically saying how much of the gray values to white, do I want to contain as one solid color? And that's what the threshold does. There's all kinds of crazy stuff you can do with thresholds. But in any case, I digress. I'm kind of getting off topic here. So basically, I have a union, right? And it creates all this crazy mess. And then what I did was I took two of them, put them together, and I created this. And all this is just basically I have an edge, right? Like we talked about before. Here's the shape, and I just basically put it as an edge. This is union together, but if I didn't do this, like if I just did edge and I did this here, you'll notice that the shapes do not cut into each other. There's an outline there, but they all cut each other because they're not union together. When they're union together, that's when the edges are only on the outside. They're not on the inside as well. Just a heads up. And then I did a colorize. Colorize is very similar to the shape renderer, right? And I probably could have done a shape renderer that probably would have worked. Yeah, it looks like it would have worked, no problems. You could have done it that way. But shape renderers are usually only typically for just shapes, and I don't know why I didn't use I probably should use that instead of colorize because the thing with the colorize is that it takes up a little bit more space. And saving space is the name of the game. Saving memory on your computer is the name of the game. And so there, so now we have that one, and we can do the same thing over here. We're going to take shape renderer, take this one, plug it into here, take this one, plug it into this one, and now we have that one, except for I forgot to plug in this. And do the hokey pokey and turn yourself around. There we go. So now I have that going on. And finally, we can do the same thing down here. We're going to take shape renderer, plug it into take this one and plug this one into here, and then take this one, plug this one into here, and plug this one into here. So now we have poop. Let's try that again. There, there. So now we have the shape renderer instead of the other way. And I'll have to do that down here too, probably. But in any case, so now we have this kind of pattern. All I'm doing here is actually just mixing them together, and I actually there's some other options down here where I've given people the option to like basically make like the solid color, right? So you can change the opacity of the solid color, you can change the opacity of the solid color of the squares, and the circles at the same time. Down here, we have different other options, like I can hit lines. And so now we have this grid system, right? And you can change the size of the lines. This is just a grid pattern. This is another node grid. It allows you to make X and Y grids. And so right now I have just a column of one. So it's not making any vertical lines, it's just making horizontal lines. I've added a color, right? So this is a color in here. All of these ones, all of these here, solid color twos, outline color. Those are all just color ins. So if you do color in like that, there it is right there. And so that's just another way of, so you're basically allowing people to modify all of these settings to basically make their own of this. I also put in the modes. Little tidbit about the modes, your video mixer here. So when you have your video mixer, let's just add a video mixer. I'll show it. It'll make more sense if I do it this way. Here's your video mixer, but we have no modes. There are no modes available. If you right click your modes or you right click your video mixer and you go to visibility, you'll notice that there's all these other options that are turned off by default. If you select one, like for instance mode, it'll add it in. So now you're able to make changes to that specific node, right? And you can do like we talked about before, right click, expose as input, and now I don't have to enter in all these at this by hand. It automatically puts them in for me. I've actually, at one point, I did want this, but I did not know you could expose that as a mode. And I actually had to type in all of these. It was a royal pain in the neck. But you can do that if you want to. I'm telling you, there's an option to do that. But in any case, there is that option. Also, I know there's a way to, you can insert a comment, right? And then when you insert a comment, it basically just puts it over the top as a UI. There's also, I believe, if you hit Command T, yeah, Command T creates a snapshot. That's something that could be user help or user friendly and helpful because you're like looking at this gigantic spaghetti monster and you're like, where am I now? You could just hit Control T here, right? And so now you get this like little image. Control T here, and so now you know, oh, okay, that's what those things do. It's a nice way of kind of keeping track, and you can remove them too. I'm just trying to remember how. I think you just click them like that, and then you can also update them with Control Shift T, and it updates the picture. There may be cases where that is no longer the image or is no longer what you want to see there. So yeah, Control T again to remove it. If you hit Control T and then you hit Control Shift T, it automatically updates that image. So nifty little feature there. And that works on all of like the video mixers. I think it'll work on some, like for instance, here's the low res. There. Okay, so low res. Let's talk a little bit about low res. Low res basically does that. It makes a low res image of your video in, right? And so right now I have a different couple different things going on here. If I hit pixel size, it'll actually just kind of expand the pixels so that this image becomes this image. And the reason why I would want to do that is because then I can take that and I can add a video mixer to that and like darken, for instance, and it creates like just a different look. Let's bring this down. Let's change this here. Let's do overlay. Darken to overlay. How did I do that? Give me a second here. Color offset. I do wrong here. That's the overlay for that one. And then this is, okay, so horizontal lines, we'll take those off. You'll notice that there's these little squares that kind of show up, and that is the low res. So, and that's set to overlay right at this moment. If I turn it to darken, it's really kind of hard to see, but if I turn it off, you'll probably see it. So if I go add pixels, turn it off, now they're smooth, right? So now you don't see the pixelated look. It's like an overlay on top of what you already have as a darken, but you could do like difference. And so now you get this kind of crazy look, right? I thought, could be interesting for other people to kind of play with and give them some, some other abilities. Displace is a lot of fun, right? And you can like then change your displace. Let's go up a little bit. So pixel opacity is the way you could change that. So now you're displacing that pixel opacity or the pixels. The pixel size is to change the actual grid size that it's using to make those pixels. And right now it's set to displace. We could do difference. We could do multiply. We just do alpha, right? And alpha, all it does is just basically creates an opacity over one over on top of the other. If I take the opacity off or the pixels off and it's just smooth now, I also have the option for color offset. Color offset is exactly like we did the first go round, I believe. The first tutorial we were talking about making a red shift and a green shift. It's hard to see here, and the reason why is because their colors are they're not like if I were to change this to white, I think you could probably see it a little better. There. Now you're seeing that like those bands of red and blue show up on the edges. And the reason being is because we're using this color offset here. And the color offset is making those changes. So yeah, now we're seeing them. So yeah, fun stuff. So that's basically the it for this patch. Any questions on this patch specifically? Can you randomize colors? I can make it to randomize colors. I'm assuming you mean down here. There is an option to randomize colors. You could make all of these change to randomize colors. You could do that by adding a float for um, like that, and then you would set a random value 0 to 1 in every one of these, except for the very last one. The last one is alpha, so you would just basically make random, random, random. So you would do random like that, and then make sure it's 0 to 1. The instances would be 3 because we have 3 values, X, Y, and Z, right? And you would just drag them in here like this, right? And then you would put a trigger on that, and we'll set this over here for just 1 second. So now we're gonna do add, right? And the reason why we're gonna do an add is because we're gonna add that to this value here, and we're gonna take this value here and change it like that, right? So it has a base value. The base value is green, but then it's changing the minimum. Let's say we don't want completely to change green to some other color. Let's say we just want to change it just a little bit. We'll say 0, 0.1 for now, right? And zero point 0.1 here for now. And so now it's going to change red, green, and blue on this value here. And we're going to basically add that into the color value. I don't know if it's going to let me. It's not going to let me. Okay, so I would need to figure out, I'm pretty sure it's probably because this is not a red, green, and blue, it's a float 4, which means that I would need to change that value to a color. I wonder if I can do 2 color. Oh, I know, color in. No, not color in. Color, solid color. That's it. Solid color. So if I do solid color, it's now going to allow me to put this value here, and then I can take this value. No, I can't change it there. There is a way to do this. You basically have to tell it that it is a color value. Right now it's set as a texture 2D RGBA, right? And it's not looking for that. It's looking for a color float or a float 4. This is not a float 4. Actually, it is a float 4. So maybe 2 data, 2 data, texture from data maybe? And maybe now? No. There is a way to do this. I'll have to look it up, but there is a way to make it do that. RGB is actually a float 4 because it's RGB and A, which would be alpha, your alpha channel. Um, so it could be because I'll have to think about that. I think you could do like solid color maybe, and then do instead of doing it this way, just do it this way and then add it. No, there's a way to do this. I just have to remember how to do it. Let me look that up because I need to. I will play around with this and figure that out. But there is a way to make that happen. Um, you can make a random generation of colors, and that was actually one of the things they added recently. It could be because it's trying to go into this gradient. That could be why it's not doing that. I'll have to play with that. This one actually gives you the option also. This is the background, and just basically I'd give it horizontal or radial. So you can make it go from bottom to top. But Sir Jumpy, I will send you a message later to talk about how we can change the colors on all of these. And it is basically you would use that random for all of them. And then it would just basically like you would probably have like 4 different randoms. And then when you hit the trigger button, it just sends it to all of them and then propagates through the entire thing. Okay, so that's this particular node patch. Let's talk about the other patch real quick. This one should be relatively simplified, crazy complicated. Basically, we have a couple different things here that are set up to basically have modified, right? You can change the color, right? You can do all kinds of crazy stuff. It has a scene oscillator to oscillate the colors. So here's the static. And the static is basically going forward and reverse. It doesn't look like it, but because it's got this oscillator, that's what it's doing. It's going backwards and forwards. And then I have it set to resolution, low res, right? And then I'm blurring it to create this pattern. I have fire turbulence is what I'm calling it. That's just a float in, and that's just a float in. Since it gets recorded, I'm hanging totally on your lips without fiddling around myself, so everything fine with the speed. I apologize. I have a tendency to talk too fast. So I'm creating a fractal noise, and then the fractal noise is being basically just take out the gray or making it into a grayscale, and then I'm blurring it. Not much, just enough to kind of give it so I'm taking out the edges, right? And then I'm taking those two things and I'm merging them together to create this. So it's like static, but then you're getting these pockets of darker areas. You go fast, but I can reference the recording later. I appreciate that. No problem. Yeah, we're gonna try our hardest to make these recordings for every single one, although I think we need to I probably need to look into a way to record what it is that I'm doing at the same time from my computer. The biggest issue there is that I've also got a lot of things going on my machine at the same time. Like I've got OBS running in order to record or to send a virtual camera, so that what you guys see is being processed into Discord. So that's the reason for that. So I need to figure out if there's a way that I can have a low overhead kind of program that running in the background. Will you share the wired files? These particular ones, I will probably share this one. The other one, I'm still debating whether or not I actually want to make that into a wire patch for Juicebar. Uh, I will, however, give the file to this for this one. So you have limited resources for any crazy graphics when you're broadcast and use wire together. Yes, basically that's the gist of it. Limited resources when you're doing graphics. uh, Especially as the patches get bigger. You'll notice down here at the bottom, I don't know if you see this, it's telling me the CPU usage, the VRAM, and the frames per second. The frames per seconds are dropping, and most likely it's because I've got OBS running and Discord running at the same time. I have a uh, i5 eighth generation processor. I have a fairly decent graphics card, but my processor needs to be sorely changed very soon, updated. So in any case, with this, I have on my iPad tonight. So those are hard to see. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so we have the fractal noise we were talking about, the grayscale. We made the low res out of the static, which is too small, so we used low res to basically up the scale. Okay. We blurred that so we get this kind of like fuzzy TV kind of look. And then we also blurred the fractal noise and we merged them together to create this kind of mess. Then I used a UV offset, which basically just takes the video mixer that I've created here and the blur that I created here. So this one is our offset for the video mixer, which creates this kind of like almost looks like what do they call that? Like it's glossy, but it's not glossy. It's there's a word for it, like solarized, like a solarized pattern. And then what I've done is I've actually added it into this video mixer, which is mixed in again with the bottom layer of the grayscale, right? The blur. So I took the blur and I took the offset and I mixed those together and I get this kind of, you can't really see it here. It's probably hard to see on your screen, but in the white pocket areas you can see like these little flecks that are kind of going through. If I increase this number, you'll probably see it a little bit more, right? So what this is doing is it's in this video mixer, it's displacing the areas from here, it's displacing over the top of this blur. So you're getting these kind of random pockets of like they're like fingers kind of, coming out. Looks like wet smoke. That's a good example. So now, what I'm doing here in this particular set, this is one of my favorite things to do. I actually have a series of colors that I'm adding into linear, and the reason why I've got four here is because I'm joining all four of those colors together and expanding it into a 20, a list of 20 colors. Okay, so from the white to the red to the orange to the brown. And what I'm doing with this expand is I'm using a clamp. And what that does for me is it creates a texture that I can colorize this. And then what I do is I used a shift from this video mixer. So I have the colorize going on here. And then in this video mixer, I'm actually sending the original. So I have two splits, right? I have this is my base from the two displaced blurs and static images. I've mixed those two together in this video mixer, and then I've split it again into the color, and then I split it into a threshold. And the reason why I split it into a threshold is so that I can adjust a mask. Okay. So I'm using a mask right here. So these dark areas, you're not going to be able to, they're going to be transparent. All the white areas are now going to be a different color. I'm rotating the hue of that color. And then I'm throwing that in a displacement. And then the only thing different is I'm adding a video mixer And then in the video mixer, I'm going to texture out. This video mixer has a delay here, and this delay is just basically blurring the edges. They're making the streaks, right? So this allows me to kind of create this kind of mess. So if I change this to like a yellow, and then I change this to more of an orange, and so it allows me to kind of just play around with this. I can make it faster, right? This one is the speed of um, the fire turbulence is the speed of the fractal. The speed below that is the static speed. So I can slow it down to 0 or give it a little bit of speed, right? So each one is independent from each other. And then what I can do is then I can displace this in any direction, and it creates this kind of messy, kind of fiery look. And then if I add red to this, there, right? And so now it's just about tweaking values, and you can just doodle all day. Like, I don't know about you guys, but I spend an awful lot of time just tweaking and tweaking and tweaking, and then I'll be like, "Oh, that's pretty. I like that." Or, "Oh, wow, I really like that. I like those colors." Or, and then, you know, 10 minutes go by and I'm like, "Wait, what was I working on?" See, so now you have this like different color set. And then if I shift the color, if I do shift color, it shifts where those blues hit. Is it there isn't a way to create presets from within Wire. You can create presets. There is a way to do that. You come up here at the very, very top and you hit this little button right here, and there's new group, right? And then there's also this button right here next to it, and that is your presets. And it'll create presets within Wire, although I'm not sure if they follow through to Arena or Avenue. I had some issues with them somehow. I don't know if I was doing it right. I'll have to play with that again, but basically there were some issues there. You can make presets in Arena and then save out the file, and those presets should save when you compile this for other people to use. And so then you can have like multiple presets for other people already set. Any questions on this one? I went relatively quick on this one. Basically, the biggest thing probably that I didn't go over was this hue rotate. This hue rotate basically just allows you to change the color. It allows you to rotate through the color scheme. Um, and then you also have the option to do the same kind of thing up here. Hue rotate and hue scale is a little bit different. I forget the difference between the two. I think one is a little bit more incrementally, and then the saturation scale is exactly that. It's the saturation of the color. Bypass is just to bypass this entire all of your nodes. There's a good portion of the nodes that have the bypass option, which just basically means when you hit the bypass that node is not being used when you have bypass on. And you can set that as a output, right? So now I have a bypass for the hue rotate if I don't want people to, if people don't want to use the bypass or hue rotate, I could just say off, um, or hue off, right? Question mark. And when you check it on, it's off, right? Or if I wanted to do it the other way around, if let's say you wanted the hue, right? You could go X and you're going to look for 1 minus X, which is going to reverse the value. So if I do it like that, and now when I turn this off, that value is off. When I turn this on, that value is on. Just a heads up. And I'll make this patch available for you guys to tweak and play until your heart's content. There's all kinds of crazy things you can do with this. And when you play with the speed, makes it faster, fire turbulence, and then the displacement can really change it around an awful lot. So it's just basically, excuse me, it's just two displacements. And I mean, you can do all kinds of crazy things with this. You just have to, your world is your oyster. You just have to decide what you want it to look like, right? I could take a gradient. Like I said, there's lots of tinkering here. I could take a gradient. I could do, we could use, well, let's do a new one, video mixer. You have to be careful about how many video mixers you use because I think, video mixer on top of video mixer on top of a video mixer, like causes, it can cause the system to be slow. But in any case, I have these two things here, right? And so now one's over the top of the other, but we could, like, this has all kinds of modes, right? Just like Photoshop. And you could do like multiply. Here's a really cool tip. When you're in Wire and you've already selected a mode, as long as you haven't touched anything else, you can just hit the down arrows, up arrows and down arrows. It'll allow you to change the color or the mode. So like right now it's on exclusion. So now we have like the opposites of the colors, right? I could do like an orange and I could do like a yellow-ish color, like a gold. And so now we have these kind of exclusions, right? But we could like make it dodge, right? And so now we get these like wild colors, right? This is the fun stuff, right? Sit here and play with, it's like eye candy for your soul.